awful, awful. Anyhow, Ambassador Dore Gold is president of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. In June 2015, Dr. Gold left the Jerusalem Center, which he had led since 2000, to serve as Director General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, appointed by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. During his tenure at the Foreign Ministry until October 2016, Ambassador Gold advanced policies that strengthened Israel on a global level from Africa and Asia to the Mideast and the Western world. He was very, very instrumental, by the way, this is Nina talking, in furthering the Abraham Accords. He was the 11th permanent representative of Israel to the United Nations, and in January 2014, he was appointed as an external advisor on international issues to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. During Netanyahu's first term in his capacity as foreign policy advisor, Ambassador Gold served as an envoy to the Palestinian Authority, Egypt, Jordan, and the Gulf states. He also served as an advisor to Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. Ambassador Gold has written books and articles on the Middle East, including The Rise of Nuclear Iran, How Tehran Defies the West, The Fight for Jerusalem, Radical Islam, the West, and the Future of the Holy City, The Tower of Babel, How the United Nations Has Fueled Global Chaos, Hatred's Kingdom, How Saudi Arabia Supports the New Global Terrorism, and a few others. His articles have appeared in, Ashai Shibun, I couldn't pronounce it, Commentary, Daily Telegraph, Die Zeit, Haaretz, Jerusalem Post, Le Monde, the New York Times, Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. He lives in Jerusalem with his very gorgeous wife, Ofra, their children and grandchildren. Dore, Toda Rabah, thank you so much for being with us today. Over to you.
Well, Nina, thank you very much. You know, when I left the United Nations, there were a number of Americans in New York who I spoke to about, well, what do I do next? And I remember one of them said, you're going to be engaged in something very important. I said, what's that? And he said, it's called the War of Ideas. And the more I have been involved in Israeli diplomacy, entry into the Arab world, whatever it is, I see that the war of ideas is absolutely critical. But I'm saying that now because I think you at Gatestone have done such an amazing job in being the cutting edge of the war of ideas. And but the articles you're putting out, the people you're having, you're not now going to that restaurant, which I one time attended to give a speech, but everything else you're doing is just extraordinary. I wanted to express my appreciation as a practitioner of Israeli foreign policy for what you're doing.
Thank you very much. It's appreciated.
Of course. And now we'll go on to some prepared remarks. There seems to be a lot of confusion about what brought on this outburst of violence. The usual suspects who don't like Israel have tried to point to things Israel did and through general types of distortions, the whole issue of property rights in East Jerusalem. Have made that into a primal cause for Palestinian grievances, as though that was the cause of this round of violence that has begun. When I looked at events on the Temple Mount, and I paid attention to certain details that gave away what this was about. Hamas, first of all, was the main organizer. It wasn't an outburst of outrage that came from something specific that Israel had done. There was the usual mythology that surrounds the Temple Mount among Islamic extremists. And that, of course, is the accusation that Israel has some plan to undermine the foundations of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. You know, that story has been around since the 1920s, when it was being used by the famous Jerusalem Mufti, Haj Amin al-Husseini, and used against the Jewish presence in Jerusalem back then. By the way, we were a majority in Jerusalem at that time. But it's been renewed, and the main purveyors of that myth have been the Muslim Brotherhood. As I'm sure all of you know, the Hamas that we are fighting today is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. If you go to the Hamas charter, they in fact admit that they are connected and advancing the agenda of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is a global jihadist organization. You know, when I tell my friends in the Gulf that Hamas has these connections with the Muslim Brotherhood, they don't know that. And they say, give us more information on these connections. But I think it's important for us to get that information out. Now, there is a wider regional context to what is happening. When I wrote a book called Hatred's Kingdom back in 2003, about 70% of the Hamas budget came from Saudi Arabia. And Hamas officials regularly visited events in Saudi Arabia. The Saudis have washed their hands of Hamas. They want nothing to do with them. And that is also true of a number of other important Gulf countries like the United Arab Emirates. So who is the main backer of Hamas? Who's writing the checks? And certainly over the last decade, the main backer of Hamas, it's not surprising, it's Iran. Now, many of you will say, well, wait a minute, Iran is Shiite and Hamas is a Sunni organization. That doesn't matter. The Iranians are looking for Sunni organizations they can back, that they can bring into their revolutionary activities across the globe. And Hamas fits beautifully into Iranian designs for exporting the Islamic Revolution. You won't see that fully thrashed out in universities in the West, but it's there and we can show it. And it's very critical for understanding what's going on. Now, another circumstance for understanding what is going on is if Iran is writing the checks, then Iran has the power of whisper. They have the power to turn to the Hamas and say, listen, we need right now for you to, you Hamas, to escalate the situation on the ground. And that's precisely what is going on. You have to see it in that context. There's a very important study if we talk about think tanks. Tony Blair, the former Prime Minister of Great Britain, has an institute in the UK called the Institute for Global Change. And I strongly recommend you find their website and look at the study that they've put out on the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Revolutionary Guards of Iran. And what you will find there is that the Revolutionary Guards and Iran itself has acted in a way that totally defied what were the expectations of the West. This is directly related to what's going on now here. You might recall there were those when the JCPOA, the Iran deal, was being advanced and concluded. There were those who said, well, if the Iran deal is finished, then we can see a considerable reduction of revolutionary activity sponsored by Iran, because Iran will have reason to be a more moderate country. Blair's Institute put out this study which actually shows that the exact opposite occurred. When was there a big escalation of Houthi aerial attacks against Saudi Arabia after the Iran deal is done. And therefore, we see what is going on as part of this post-Iran deal environment that's been created. Another sample of that is what's been going on in the Western Sahara and Morocco, where the Western Sahara forces have gotten support from Iran through the through various through Hezbollah, essentially. The Polisario, backed by Hezbollah, started engaging in activities that would undermine the Moroccan government. For that reason, just a few years ago, Morocco cut diplomatic relations with the Iranians. So I'm going into this because this is the context to understand, what we're facing. It has nothing to do with denying Muslims access to the Temple Mount. They have full access. It has nothing to do with the property debate or discord in parts of Jerusalem. It has everything to do with Iran's interests and what it is pushing the Hamas to do. Now, the other giveaway about what were the motives here is that when the Israeli police had no choice but to go up on the Temple Mount and even go into the two mosques, they discovered a huge amount of pre-positioned weaponry of different sorts. The Hamas uses all kinds of fireworks as a weapon. They can launch fireworks not vertically into the air, but horizontally at someone they want to wound. So that was discovered. But even more indicative of what Hamas was up to were these huge mitzborim,
stores.
Huge quantities of rocks that were found on beautiful religious carpets in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And what are those rocks doing there? Well, the rocks are used to throw at police, at Muslim enemies of theirs, and at Jews. Remember, the Temple Mount is above the Western Wall, so that if you have rocks, you can throw them at the Jews below. And that's exactly what they do. So we saw all this preparatory work. This was not a spontaneous riot. This was all well planned. And it was well planned because Hamas had an interest in escalating, in escalatory violence as at this time. So we have obviously noted what Hamas is up to. They wanted to turn the initial violence, which was near the Gaza Strip, into a Jerusalem-centered violence, which is what they did. And then they continued, basically focusing more on Gaza in the last few days. And it has created an environment in which Hamas now feels it's legitimate to attack Israel with rockets and missiles of increasingly greater ranges. The escalating use of rockets against Israeli civilian targets reminds me exactly of what Iran has been doing in the last 2 years with the Houthis in Yemen, where you now have rockets, you have unmanned aerial vehicles employed against Saudi Arabia employed against civilian areas in Saudi Arabia, like the capital Riyadh. And so this same style of operation that you see there, you now see here. And therefore, if it's legitimate to attack a Muslim holy city in the Arabian Peninsula, it is certainly legitimate to attack Jerusalem from the viewpoint of Hamas. And it was shocking the other day hearing air raid sirens go off in Jerusalem. But Jerusalem was attacked. Another instrument of violence which the Hamas has been using rather effectively in the Gaza Strip, but now they brought it to Jerusalem, are these combustible balloons that carry combustible liquids, which are sent into Israeli civilian areas. So that's been going on. And after the attacks in Jerusalem, they didn't stop. They didn't say, okay, we attacked Jerusalem, check. End of campaign. They escalated further. They wanted to show their capabilities, which have grown over the last number of years. And those capabilities included an ability to attack not just Tel Aviv, but north of Tel Aviv and in the neighboring suburban cities around Tel Aviv, like Holon. There was a direct hit on an Israeli bus in Holon, adjacent to Tel Aviv, and the flames coming out of that bus were all over Israeli television. So we were watching that, and we saw what Hamas is up to. Now, in the meantime, the government of Israel has had to develop a counter strategy, counter tactics to deal with this. And I think there was a kind of quiet hiatus while Israel was studying what was going on. Studying means also accumulating intelligence information about the whereabouts of Hamas leaders. Where are they hiding? Hamas has created an above ground command structure, but there's also there's an underground city in the Gaza Strip, which Hamas has built up to protect their commanders. And that underground city had to also be understood. So now you're seeing today for the first time a real strong Israeli move against Hamas commanders. For example, there is a brigade commander in the Gaza Strip whose name is Bassam Issa. It's not that important what his exact name is, but he was eliminated today. There's also the gentleman who is the head of the cyber command of Hamas. He lost his life today. And there are at least 4 or 5 others. And it's only the beginning of Israeli moves at the Hamas command structure. Israel always has to take into account when it gets into these urban wars with Hamas that it will not carpet bomb the Gaza Strip. Israel will not use the tactics of the Russians in Chechnya, but in which you sort of, drop huge amounts of munitions over vast areas. What Israel does do is it seeks out where are the commanders who are responsible for this violence, and you eliminate them. It's a little harsh for Americans sometimes to hear, but it's what has to be done. It's a moral way of conducting warfare by directing fire against those who are most responsible for the violence that you're facing. This is not going to be a quick campaign. For Israel to receive Egyptian diplomats who have just spoken to Hamas and then reach a ceasefire is not a way to go forward. I think Israel has to make a crushing blow against Hamas so that Hamas will understand they lost and Israel won. And that if they ever do this again, the price will be prohibitive. The other thing we're going to have to do, and this is not going to be easy, is we're going to have to make sure the international community doesn't turn against the state of Israel, which frequently happens. Start with the Europeans. Europe received some help from our vaccination programs, and we shared, vaccination materials that we got from American companies. And Israel has been trying to help Europe. Our entire gas and oil program in the Eastern Med has been there partly to relieve Europe of excessive dependence on Russian gas. Well, if you're going to look to Israel for help, you better treat Israel in a certain, I would say, in a proper way. And I'm sure that that's what the next Israeli government will seek from Europeans. As far as the U.S. goes, the U.S. has been an ally of Israel. We have been an ally of the U.S. And sometimes there may be a spokesman in Washington who says something that we don't particularly care for, but that's a small price to pay for all the support which we get from the United States. This whole conflict, it would be best if it was over in a week, because I don't think that's going to happen. Not if we want to be thorough, and not if we want to make it painful for Hamas commanders, but not for innocent people in the Gaza Strip. That'll probably be the overall strategy which we will pursue. And I was very much a person who was involved in those strategies in the past, particularly when I was asked to debate Justice Goldstone about a previous Gaza campaign. We're going to have to bring our arguments, our strategies, our military operations to be seen by the United Nations and by anybody else who's asking questions. What we can be hopeful about is that in a body like the European Union, you need a full consensus to take any measures against Israel, the kind that some of the European states always love to initiate. That consensus isn't there today. And so we'll get our arguments out, we'll make our presentations, and most importantly, we'll defend the people of Israel. I'll stop here, and I'd gladly amplify any of these issues in Q&A.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Gold. That was absolutely magnificent and very helpful. I'm sure there are a lot of questions. Mimi, have you got questions there?
Yes, I do.
There's a thing at the bottom of your gizmo that you sort of poke it, and Mimi will relay your questions to the ambassador. Thank you so much.
Thank you. If you would all press the Q&A button at the top of your screen and then write your questions, that would be terrific. Thank you so much. So, Ambassador, thank you. Starting with the many questions that we have for you today. Do you think that the Biden administration's policies of backing Iran and the Palestinians again and abandoning the Abraham Accords have caused the current conflict?
If you have a security structure in place that suits your definition of your interests, America had NATO in 1949, and it suited American interests in stopping the spread of Soviet military power. You don't try and undermine that structure, you try and strengthen it. I think what happened with the Abraham Accords is you had the beginnings of an Israeli Arab understanding which could be used to help contain the spread of Iranian power. When I started my work on the Middle East, the Iranians seemed to be confined to the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf. Well, now they're in the Red Sea, and they're even moving into the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
You should have a coordinated effort to block that, to balance that. The Iranian militias I mentioned in the study by the Tony Blair Institute are all over the Middle East, and they are causing concern to old American allies like Morocco. So right now, I don't see the current administration embracing the containment mechanisms that were developed by the previous administration. But I could see a situation where they would embrace this. But that's up to also us in the Middle East. You know, I run the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. And one of the things I started doing back in 2015 was linking up with Arabs from the Gulf and seeing where we had joint interests and strategies. If they said something which I thought was important for the government to hear, I would go to the prime minister with them, with that information. And in the last, I would say 8 months or so, I've been flying to the Gulf, and I've been to both Abu Dhabi and to Bahrain, and I have shared our outlooks. I have found tremendous support for that perspective, the perspective of the state of Israel. And I hope that we can do more together if we can get a network of think tanks that can maybe set the stage for doing something far more ambitious that I can turn over to the government of Israel.
That's certainly something to think about. Barry Wolf asks you, what do you think of US negotiations re the Iran deal?
The Iran deal is a failure. And it's a failure because look how it defined what it was supposed to accomplish. It was supposed to bring about more moderate Iranian behavior among the states of the Middle East. As I said before, the opposite occurred. It's a failure because Iran hid many of its nuclear facilities from inspection by the International Atomic Energy Agency. So its illicit nuclear program expanded, it didn't contract. And it's a failure because eventually states in the Middle East are not just going to sit on their hands. They will have to develop their own deterrent systems to hold back the Iranian problem. And when that happens, rather than being a cause for non-proliferation, the Iran deal could become one of the greatest stimulants for proliferation among many Arab states. So we are concerned. We are concerned with the verification rules that the old Iran deal put in place. We hope they'll be changed, but I doubt it. And I think Iran keeps acting like if it just will be firm, the problems with American pressure will go away.
Would you say the current conflict that's going on right now between Israel and Gaza is an Iranian proxy war? Who is funding the weapons in Hamas?
Well, as I said when I wrote a book on Saudi Arabia in 2003, 2004, most of the funding came from Saudi Arabia. Today, the Saudis won't give Hamas a dime, and the money comes from Iran. So if Iran needs money and funding, maybe it could seek it from Qatar, but Qatar is very specialized in its funding. It doesn't really go into the military equipment side, but Iran certainly does.
And George Russell asks, following from that, do you see these Hamas attacks as an Iranian test in advance of the next Israeli government? If so, what was the intended objective, and to what extent has it succeeded or failed?
Well, it's hard to have a test when you don't have a government. So I think that it's a test of Israel in general. I think the people of Israel have a very strong view of what has to be done to protect this country. And they'll give any government that emerges support if it takes a strong stand in neutralizing what Hamas is trying to accomplish.
And on the subject of Iran, how do you see the current situation in Iran in general today?
Iran is a weak country, and ironically, in many respects. And the sanctions that were put on Iran by the United States were extremely effective for causing that weakening in the Iranian economy, for example. I think if a new Iran deal is concluded and billions of dollars are transferred to the Iranians, they won't be so weak. They will start producing weaponry, bribing jihadi groups, and causing Israel, the United States, and the entire Western Alliance a very difficult time.
And turning to another country of great concern, what are your views of China? Is there an awareness in Israel that China wants to steal Israel's high tech and eventually dominate the planet?
Well, I don't know if anybody has got a sort of a conclusive proof of what China's plan is. But I think there's a concern that you have to be careful when you deal with the Chinese. And we do a lot of business out in the in Asia, we, the State of Israel, and Israeli companies. And therefore, the government of Israel and the Ministry of Defense watches very carefully what China's up to. I visited China back in 2014. I was a guest, actually, of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. And I lectured in their military schools. And I found that the Chinese were asking me, so whose side are you on? The side of America or the side of China? And I made it clear to them that we are an ally of the United States. But China's on a roll. I have also found that countries that are having a difficult time with China have been seeking to get close to us. For example, I had a visit here of the Vietnamese ambassador asking me when I could come to Hanoi, of all places. But as you well know, Vietnam and China have had a very difficult time over the years. So I think it would be helpful if there was an alliance network in the Pacific, and that Israel could sort of be an informal member of, and therefore our resources and our knowledge could be put to work to a, let's call it a containment structure, rather than just be available to whoever is going to give us a check.
And Barry Wolf asks, what about China's influence and relationship with Iran today going forward?
That is an excellent point, because obviously if Iran detected that it had problems with China because of what it was doing, that would be one of the strongest factors in holding Iran back. But I don't think they hear anything like that. I can tell you this, when I was in China at the time, I prepared material on Iranian strategy, Iranian goals, and I had it translated in Israel by China specialists. And I presented that material when I lectured in the Central Committee of the Communist Party. One of the issues that I raised that I think is something which we're going to have to do more about is are the declarations of Iran that they called for wiping Israel off the map. And, there are clearly international treaties against incitement to genocide. And I think we're going to have to start talking about that, not just turning around and ignoring it.
And a question from Julianne Fain. Ambassador, Hamas is funded by Iran. Obama gave money to Iran. So this current administration, i.e. Biden-Obama 3, is funding terror in Israel. Can Republicans not force the Biden administration to act differently, as we all seem to be sitting flat-footed while hundreds of rockets kill Israelis?
Well, if Republican or Democratic officials would speak out against what Iran is supporting with Hamas, that would be beneficial. But you have to understand, as an Israeli diplomat, even though I am not currently in government, I'll always be reluctant to take sides in American domestic politics. I'll watch Fox News with the door closed at 5 in the morning in Jerusalem, but I will not, speak, in the kind of tone or with the kind of approach of some of those very smart announcers on Fox News. And I would not also speak in a way that seemed to be supporting CNN in any way. But, I think Israel needs good relations with both parties. But what it should do, as soon as it sees something which is problematic, that it has serious issues with, it should speak up. And that's what I did in the past, and that's what I'll do in the future.
Thank you. And another question, this one from George Perlman. Do you think, Ambassador, that these large number of rockets have reawakened the vulnerability of the Israelis to just this sort of attack, which had been talked about before? And will there be enough of a response to warn Hamas that the price will be exceedingly high?
Will there be enough of a what to warn Hamas?
A response so that the price will be very, very high.
I think that's what people are talking about who are speaking to our military command, that the military is saying, we have got to make it clear to Hamas that they've lost this, that they took too big of a risk, and you can't attack Israel with impunity. I think it'll be very clear when you see the Israeli response. But if you're going to carpet bomb the Gaza Strip and just drop bombs across Gaza, and that's all you want to do, you could do that very quickly, within 10 minutes of Israel being attacked. But if you want to use precision-guided munitions, and if you want to pick out the Hamas leaders with the tweezers and get at them while not killing innocent civilians, that takes a little time. It takes time to get the information, and it takes time to implement. And but at the end of the day, the effect of what Israel will do will be, I think, very visible and very much felt.
What is Russia up to now?
Well, Russia still, I think, looks back at the loss of the Cold War with deep regret. And therefore, they see all this as a zero-sum game. When America loses, Russia gains. And when Russia loses, America gains. And it's very problematic. I have to commend Prime Minister Netanyahu, who on the one hand had very close ties to the United States, and at the same time was able to wage a war against the Iranians on Syrian soil while keeping the Russians in the picture. The Russians knew what we were doing when we took out the vast military infrastructure of Iran and parts of the Syrian state, but you never saw them saying, that's enough, you can't do that anymore. They understood how the spread of Iranian power on Syrian territory was very much against Israeli interests. So we operated there, and we operated all over the skies of Syria.
Right. And now the next couple of questions concern our other neighbors in the hood, starting with Saudi Arabia. Could you kindly give us an update on how you see Saudi Arabia now and MBS?
Well, they have not had an easy time. I don't know to the extent to which you are aware of how Saudi Arabia has come under attack with advanced weapons, Iranian weapons, launched from Yemeni soil. It was extensive over the last 2 years. And as I said, right in the heart of the Saudi capital, Riyadh, and also in the center of the Saudi oil and gas industry. There's the Abqaiq facilities that were hit. So it wasn't as though Saudi Arabia suffered as peripheral interests were hurt. Central interests of the Saudi infrastructure, they weren't taken out, but they were badly damaged. Now, I think they had hoped they would have more support from their Western allies. And it's not just the United States, it's also Great Britain, it's also France, but that didn't happen. And so the Saudis have been operating with uncertainty, which is why I think, and I wasn't surprised when this started, the Saudis have been in some kind of dialogue with Iran. They're not that I think they have any expectations of what could come out of that dialogue, but perhaps they could give Iran pause before Iran supports yet another wave of Houthi air attacks on the Saudi civilian infrastructure. As far as how Saudi Arabia has changed, you know, when I studied what Saudi Arabia had been up to in the 60s and 70s and 80s, Saudi Arabia, despite hosting American military forces, Saudi Arabia was perhaps one of the major financiers of extremist organizations in the Sunni world. And that put Saudi Arabia on the same side as Al-Qaeda. But the Saudis woke up and said, enough, this is a mistake, and we have to go a different way. And I think they should be rewarded and supported. Now, one of their problems is every country makes mistakes. And there was this whole issue of Mr. Khashoggi. I don't know exactly what happened there, but I would not condemn Saudi Arabia, and I wouldn't put them into isolation because of his death, if it was caused unintentionally or intentionally. I think there has to be a very clear dialogue on the subject if it's important to the United States. But don't lose Saudi Arabia. They're an important ally of America. And they have been that since FDR met with Ibn Saud in the Great Bitter Lake in 1945.
Absolutely. And another, how do you see the current situation in Syria?
Well, Syria is a country that's falling apart. It's falling apart because of its own policies. Syria was always a country made up of minority groups. In fact, the most powerful minorities in Syria were, how do I put this? Let me take that back. The various minority groups in Syria have had critical powers and have held critical positions in the Syrian governmental structure. But right now, Syria is facing something. It's a nightmare of its own creation, because pro-Shiite militias are increasingly taking over Syrian territory. In certain parts of Syria that were populated by Sunni Arabs, those Arabs have been thrown out, exiled, and Shiites from different parts of the Islamic world have been brought in. You know, there's a large Shiite population in Afghanistan, Pakistan, even India, but particularly the Pakistani Shiites and the Afghan Shiites have been brought in large numbers, trained by the Revolutionary Guards, and engaged in warfare on behalf of Iranian interests. So Syria has lost territory to these groups that the Iranians have been using as part of their geostrategic chess game in the Levant.
Right. If I may ask on that point, the present crisis perpetrated by Hamas, do you think that would give Hezbollah in the north any opportunity or desire to start trouble on Israel's northern border?
Much would depend on what Iran says. If the Iranians turn to Hezbollah and say, look, we've invested in you for 15 years. Now is the time for you guys to get into this fight and open up a second front against Israel. Very dangerous for the state of Israel, something we could overcome, but it would be a very dangerous addition to the current war.
And other neighbors, what about Egypt and Jordan? What are relations like now with them?
Well, I think General Sisi has understood Israel's problems and has had a dialogue, but they keep it military to military. The Egyptians are not active in developing, civilian cooperation. You don't see the Egyptians having a people-to-people initiative that, like, for example, you might see with the United Arab Emirates. And the Jordanians are always in an impossible situation and looking to get out of it somehow. And part of getting out of it is taking a hard line on Israel when at the same time they're receiving Israeli assistance in the security field.
Yes.
Dore, forgive me for jumping in. It's Nina. Why do you think that Egypt is being so contained in its coolness or warmth toward Israel, keeping it military to military?
I just don't think they feel comfortable yet in terms of, and it's a limitation that they created in having civilian programs. I remember when Mubarak was president, and I came with Bibi to Cairo, and I said to them, Israelis are going in droves to Turkey for vacation. If you guys would just become a little more flexible, we could have those Israeli tourists in Egyptian cities, and you would benefit hugely in terms of your tourism dollars. But that didn't seem to be a consideration. They have a real ideological problem with Israel, which they haven't gotten out of.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Going now to your old stomping ground, the UN. What are your thoughts, please, about the UN and its agencies, the Security Council and the United States refunding the World Health Organization?
Well, the World Health Organization is now one of the main suspects, or is being suspected, of having looked the other way as the COVID crisis began and spread. So, you've got to decide whether the World Health Organization is an American interest or a world interest. I don't think it is. But my general view of the UN, having worked there, is just keep the UN out of everything that may mean something to you. because once they get involved, it'll reflect the joint interests of a lot of bad states and not your interest. And, it can be very dangerous. I saw the UN involved in sensitive areas. Sometimes it did decent work, but that was the exception, not the rule.
Right. Nina, thank you very, very much, Ambassador. Nina, over to you.
Yes, that was extraordinary. Thank you so much, Ambassador Gold. And I'm just trying to think, what do you think might be the role that the Americans could do to be helpful to Israel right now?
Stay strong and stay the course. What America can do is America can establish standards of international behavior. That sounds a little abstract, but it really isn't. Don't get into double standards. Don't say, well, we hope the Hamas or the Palestinians will not launch missiles against Israel, and Israel will not create a violent environment for the Palestinians. Why do you have to do that? There's one side here that is engaging in outright war and aggression, and that's Hamas. So don't try and create false parallelisms that make you feel good. The Arabs that you care about, the Sunnis in the Gulf, for example, hate Hamas. So when you bend over backwards to try and make them feel that you are taking into account Palestinian interests, you're just pissing people off, not just Israelis. So let America stand for international standards, and that will accelerate the possibility, not of peace, but certainly some kind of modus vivendi and an end to armed conflict. But if you play the game of, well, both sides are problematic and both sides are guilty of irresponsible behavior, you're just going to extend the conflict even longer.
Why do you think the Americans wanted so badly to revive the Iran deal? I really can't understand it.
Pardon?
Why do you think the Biden administration wanted so badly to revive the Iran deal? As you said, it was a failure. What are they doing?
Well, I think this is I think this is ideological diplomacy. In other words,
what does that mean?
What that means is you become convinced, not because somebody proved it, but because you ideologically believe in it, that it is possible for Iran to become a good friend of the U.S. I was looking into this when I wrote my book, The Rise of Nuclear Iran, and I found there was a whole cottage industry in Washington and somewhat in New York of people who believed that, well, what hurt America? Osama bin Laden. What was Osama bin Laden? He was a Sunni. The Iranians are Shiites. They take a different view of the world. Maybe America should make an alliance with Shiite Iran against the Sunnis in the Gulf, for example. And that's like an ideological theory. It's not something provable, but it very much was sustained by a lot of people, mostly on the Democratic Party side in the United States. Hopefully they have woken up when they see Iranian behavior around the Middle East.
Well, it doesn't seem that way, but we cannot thank you enough for your time and your wisdom, your seichel. It's just always illuminating to hear from you and to talk with you. Thank you very, very much, Mr. Ambassador. And we're wishing you and dear Israel well. And Thank you all so much, Mimi, Annie, Grayson, all you wonderful, especially you wonderful Gatestonians who've been such loyal friends. And we hope we see you next week on Wednesday, May 19th at 2 p.m., not 11:30, with Ayan Hirsi Ali, who will be talking about her new book, Pray, Immigration, Islam, and the Erosion of Women's Rights. Hope you have a wonderful week. Again, thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador. And please, everybody,
Nina,
have a wonderful week.
thank you for having me. I appreciate being hosted by you. And Mimi has always been a good friend. And it's good to be with good friends in hard times.
Thank you. Well, listen, we're praying for Israel and wishing all of you the best. And we will try and help as much as we can from far away. Take care. Have a good week, everybody, considering. And please stay well, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.